Hi, Fran, are you there?
I am.
Okay, great. So, Fran, I'll let you go ahead and take it away here this morning. I just want to say quickly before we jump off, we're going to take questions via the chat feature in the webinar. If folks can go ahead, I will be the question moderator. Go ahead, submit your questions via chat. We've got a series of great presentations here. Ask your questions, and we'll kind of stack them towards the end. Hopefully, our presenters can take a few minutes at the tail end, and we'll answer as many as is possible. So, with that, Fran, go ahead.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to the conversation and hearing from you at the end of this, your questions. I recognize that everybody's got questions right now about how we go about looking at revenue, what the impact of revenue is, and that everyone is looking for specific and definite answers. And I will tell you up front that, at least from Avenue and Analytics, you won't get definite and specific answers. It's almost impossible to do that, but you will get the best answers that we can divine of the existing data and information that's out there and that we spend a great deal of time looking at and analyzing. We're going to start talking this morning about revenue assumptions and why they're so important and so difficult in this time to get into place, but how important they are as we go forward into trying to put together budgets and budget outlooks and revenue projections for our policy bodies and our communities. There we go. Projections are both art and science. They use the best data available. They're hopefully we use more science data than art. And one of the problems that I find is oftentimes analysts that are putting together budget assumptions tend to use the past year's budget and simply make percentage assumptions. It's going to increase 10% or 20% or decrease. And they don't really go look at the data that's out there and how the data may have changed and how that impacts the assumptions. And what we'll be talking about today is you cannot do that in this environment. It is absolutely critical that you almost start from the beginning on your budget assumptions and gather information from as many diverse sources as possible. And it's very time consuming, it's very labor intensive, but in this environment, it is absolutely, absolutely critical. So why do they matter? Well, beyond the things that I just mentioned, they corral the chaos. And that means that they build on what we can learn out there, what's new, what's happening. They're well-developed assumptions ground your financial projections. They underlie the projections. They provide the foundation and something that you can rely on when you're challenged. If you're making only percentage assumptions, there's very little that you can point to say, well, this is why I think that, or this is what the information I have. But if you have really good assumptions grounded in information that you pulled from your community, from your business folks, from your nonprofits, from any source of information you can get out there that's going to have better assumptions together. It also, once you do that and you have good assumptions and you have them grounded in actual community information, then it gives your policy body cover when the news is bad or good. It allows them to say that, and to make changes to say, hey, we did our best with the information we had. Now we have new information and we need to make changes. And so it provides credibility to that policy, to that evolution of policy that's going to go on now and probably for the next 2 to 4 years or 5 years. The other thing it does is it fences in the knowns. It gives you a body of knowns that you can work with, and it also identifies the unknowns so that you can put those out there and say, we don't know these things. If you don't do the work behind this, you don't have that information to rely upon. So the best practices when developing budget assumptions in any environment, but very specifically in the COVID environment, is making sure that they're specific to your community. We're all getting a lot of data from the state, from the county government, from even the feds, and from a lot of other sources of, weighing in with opinions. But when it push comes to shove, the really important thing here when building your budget assumptions is making them specific to your community. The impact of COVID is very different on a community dependent on restaurants and hospitality than it is on one based on an Amazon or other large logistical distribution centers. It's just critical. A community that has a large hospitality event like a Disneyland or something like that is going to have much greater impact on sales tax, on other revenue, hotel tax, all those things, than a community that has none of those things but relies mostly on small businesses and non-hospitality, non-restaurant. So specific to your community is essential at any time. It is absolutely fundamental and critical in this time. Also, be inclusive with your gathering your input. It's a very dangerous thing to sit in our offices and assume that based on what we're hearing in the media or what we're hearing from our various news sources is actually happening with our business community, for instance. We need to get out and call key tax generators in our community and say, what's going on with your business? What are your projections? What do you see happening? Talking to your chamber, talking to your downtown business association. As many different sources as you have time and resources to reach out to, very, very critical. That broad input will give validity to your assumptions, which then give validity to your budget numbers, which then give validity to the policy decisions that your boards make. Being transparent, saying what you do know and what you don't know. Being very honest about it. We don't know that. We do know this. Here's how we arrived at this number. We went through this process. We got this kind of data. Very, very important not to be reticent to share how you arrived at a specific number. And communication about all of this is, again, always important. But now communication becomes critical because not only are we putting forth our budget assumptions, we're revising them and we're revising them again, and we'll probably revise them for a third or fourth time. Therefore, it is really, really important that we communicate each time we do that, why we're doing it, what's behind it. Because if nothing else, when it comes time to make adjustments for your budget, do layoffs, take cuts, reduce services, and you have to have conversations with your community, your policy body, and your labor groups. If you haven't communicated well ahead of that, they're going to challenge your numbers, and your numbers are not going to have validity in those conversations, making them much more difficult. So the pandemic, as we know, and we just said, is specific to your community, but we get conflicting information from different sources. A lot of that information is out of our control, and it's about unfamiliar things that we as budget analysts, as finance people, as city managers have not had to consider before in the past. Vaccines, PPE, all kinds of things. Hospitals that are overwhelmed, and how do we handle it? Testing sites. Things like that now have to be considered. The cost of those things, the impact on our community, all of those things. So it's an uncomfortable situation that we find ourselves in. What we have to do is what we at Avenue have done, and what we communicate to our clients is develop multiple scenarios. Yeah, it's impossible under the COVID situation to settle down on one scenario and say, this is what I think is going to happen. It's much more logical and gives your policy body more wiggle room to say, this is what we think is the worst possible situation. This is what we think is the best possible situation. We will refine that as we gather more information, but this is where we are now. That's very, very important. You just are going to have to do that. That you have to decide what your resources are for each scenario and whether or not you can fund them. In this environment, we are so lacking in resources, and watching our revenues drop dramatically here in sales tax and transit occupancy tax and a number of other areas. Some revenue staying stable, but not really increasing. So when we lay out these resources for each scenario, how do we fund them? And again, if your assumptions are not solid, if you're not looking at those things, if you're not gathering as much information as possible, then you really have an issue. We can't control the factors again for the outcome, the behavior of people, the politics that are going on, whether there's a vaccine or not, what kind of treatment is out there and whether it's successful. Those things are all out of our control. And the only thing we can do is keep ourselves informed and incorporate that information into our thinking and to our assumption development as best as we possibly can. The economy. Normally, we have an economy that we can look back at and say, in 2008, we had a Great Recession. In the early 20s, mid 20s, we had a Great Depression. Here's what it looked like. Here's what happened. Here's why it happened. And this is how we pulled out of it. This is very different. And so we've got a situation where we don't have a historical reference, or at least a historical reference that we can feel super comfortable with. We in Avenue have been looking both at the Great Recession and the Great Depression and saying, what's different about those two? And Tom will talk a little bit more about that. And how did we arrive at the assumptions that we did that we're presenting to you under our baseline data? We've also been looking at the Spanish flu. How is that different? What happened there? How long did it take for the economy to come back? Again, the more information you have, the more you have information about driving expenditures. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But recognize that, again, you are in a different situation now with COVID than we were back in 2008 with the Great Recession, or even as our parents were back in the Great Depression. Different things caused each one of those, and this is a different cause here that doesn't have a reference point, and that makes your job even that much more difficult. All you have to do is look at the rapid changes that have occurred from January to May in the information that we have, or from April 15th to May 15th. Major changes in information and direction. Opening business didn't look going to happen until maybe the end of April. Then it was the end of May. It was the end of June. Then it was possibly July. Now it's coming back to May. Hard to keep up with, but very, very important that we keep gathering information from as many sources as we can, and that we keep it specific to our communities as best as we possibly can. The recovery is something that we don't always look at, and particularly in an unstable and unsure situation like we have here, it is really, really important that we look at the recovery at the same time that we're looking at the response and the reaction. We can't forget it, and we have to plan for it for the initial response. Had we as an organization, had we as a community, had we as a country looked at how we reopened business at the same time that we shut business down, we would be in a much better position than we are today. What we did instead was to shut business down, breathe a sigh of relief. Okay, we got it shut down. Let's take a look at stuff. Let's see what's going on. And oh my goodness, now we have to figure out how to open it. And by that time, the pressure had built to open, had built up and to open business. And we weren't able, most politicians, most elected officials have not been able to make good decisions without that undue pressure on them at this point, because in most cases, state, federal, and others, they did not look at what the recovery looked like before they were face to face with it. So very incredibly important that we do that. The other thing I want to talk about, and this is probably something you've heard over and over again, but it's something that I found to be true in my job as city manager and other things that I've done in life, and that I firmly believe in, and that is within every crisis, there are opportunities. And what I also find is that very frequently, we in government miss those opportunities because we are so swept up in the present, so swept up in responding and reacting that we forget to look forward. And now, as we make our budget assumptions, as we put our budgets together, it is really critical that we look at what opportunities are out there for change, for doing something different. Simple things like opening the streets up, closing streets and opening up the streets for restaurants. It's not that we rush in and we make a code change or a zoning change, but rather we make that code change and zoning change for a reason, because we see something that could evolve and be an advantage for our community going forward. And then looking at the costs and the savings. Very critical and hard to do. And if you're not talking together, if you're not talking with your community, if you're not really looking data out there as you develop your budget assumptions, you will miss the opportunities and then worry and wonder about how you did that. How did we miss them? What kind of community do we want to be? And those folks that are in finance, those folks that are putting the budgets together, the city manager's office that has to review that, and the department heads that are putting their own budgets together. If you look for opportunities within this crisis, we'll find that we'll come out of this thing a lot better than we expected. And I think it's really, really important. The future, challenges and opportunities. And the pandemic is just another disaster. You know, from it, we're going to learn, we're going to prepare, we're going to plan, we're going to respond, we're going to recover, and hopefully we will improve so that the next time, and there will be a next time, just like earthquakes, there will be another pandemic somewhere along the way. We will be much better prepared and remember the lessons that we have learned in here. It's very, very important we look at data, we rely on data, but we also look at our experience and our analysis and our own intuitive understanding of our communities when we're putting together budget alternatives and budget assumptions. When we plan for the recovery, when we plan for the future, we need to look at the costs and the risks because they're all there. And taking advantage of opportunities requires flexibility, imagination, risk-taking, and resources. And if all we're doing is putting out our resources, budgeting our resources to the reaction mode, to the response mode, and not looking forward to either the recovery or the future, we will miss those opportunities or we'll be caught flat-footed when they come by and we won't be able to take advantage of them. Defining options and alternatives, we've talked about that. That's really what we have to do here. It's dangerous to settle on one set of budget assumptions and build your budgets on that without recognizing that nothing is certain, nothing is set in stone. We don't have that luxury in this pandemic. So alternatives and options must be something that budget people keep out there. The desired outcomes, what do we want the outcome to be? That's got to go with every budget assumption that you make. What's the desired outcome if I make this assumption? Where do I want our community to go? Where does my elected officials, where do they want this community to go? Putting that plan together for the future at the same time that you're putting together your response, reaction, and recovery, very, very important, extremely difficult. But somebody in your organization needs to be looking at that and working at that on the same time. And of course, with all of it, you always want accountability. You want to know, how do we know if we've recovered? How do we know if we've taken advantage of opportunities and the outcome of that action? Extremely critical, very important, and something that is easy to forget when you're under pressure and you're scrambling like crazy to try and keep up with such uncertain times. So once again, specific to your community, very, very important, regardless of the national trends. We've got startling first-time events and unstable data. Therefore, doing various scenarios is very, very important. Being willing to change your assumptions when you get new data, communicating that why you've changed it, what the basis was, taking advantage of crisis and opportunity, responding to crisis, taking advantage of the opportunity, critical in going forward, often missed when we're reactive and responsive to something, but not looking forward. Remembering to be transparent, why we do something, how we gather the data, what we thought when we were doing it. Reach out, be inclusive to as many different sectors in your community as possible. And I mean that sincerely. As many sectors as you can take time to talk to, it is important that you get their information. Getting good, broad input, very, very important. And then I will close by saying, I cannot stress enough in the COVID environment as you're putting together budgets, and many of you have already submitted your first budget to your councils in early May. Hopefully you don't get them adopted until probably mid-June, thereabouts, maybe end of June. During that process, communicate, revise your assumptions, revise your budget as often as you need to, communicate those revisions, communicate why you're doing it, ask questions, talk to people, gather information, tell people what you're doing and why you're doing it, and revise again. Very, very, very critical. And I thank you very much for listening.
Fran, thanks so much for that. I'm going to move pretty directly over to Tom Adams, Fran's colleague at Avenue Services. So Tom, I'm going to make you the panelist, or the presenter rather. And, just briefly, folks, Tom has been with Avenue Community Services for the last, nearly the last 3 years, but had 20 years in California local governments before then, predominantly in the Bay Area as both a management analyst and economic development director in a number of Bay Area cities. He's an expert on municipal finance. We feel grateful that he's with us today. And thanks again to Fran. And Tom, take it away.
Thanks, Rob. Again, Tom Adams with Avenue Insights and Analytics. Many of you know us as Muni Services here in California. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank everyone on the call that working for local government agencies. Having worked for local government for about 20 years, I know how hard it can be at times. I've really been amazed at how well everything's gone here in California. I know it's been stressful and difficult for many reasons and sometimes scary. So a big thank you to all of you for your hard work, and here's to more success going forward. Again, I think California and especially communities have done a great job with the health part of the virus so far. So just wanted to give you a quick layout of what we're talking about today. Trying to give you some context on kind of what's going on with the recession, what's going on with the economy, some forecasting assumptions that Fran had just talked about, quickly go into some revenue trends and some things that are happening at the state and federal. So there is a lot of bad news out there, as we all know. So keys to staying sane, Fran had gone through some of these. Fauci had talked about humility. I think if our epidemiologists and our economists, nationally are struggling with what's going on, how are we on the local level going to have more information? So, having that lack of control can be a stressful thing, but trying to keep your sphere of influence to those things that you do know and that you can control is, I think, key during this time. Flexibility, again, as Fran had mentioned, to kind of revise and remain flexible as information changes, as the data changes. The ability to see 6 months out and say we may need to change things in 6 months, may need to change things in 12 months. Transparency, Fran had mentioned this as well. Very key to put your cards on the table, both for your council and for your communities. I think, acknowledging the amount of unknowns and saying this is kind of where we're going for now, and we'll check back with you on it. Lastly, I think it's important to what I call know thyself. Is Fran had mentioned during her presentation, it's key to know your revenue sources and what are the impacts of some of those outside influences. Sometimes we use some national information, say on GDP. GDP does not necessarily translate to sales tax. So, it's important to know who's in your community and how they will be affected. So just a few comments on recessions. They're created by something that is unforeseen. What the technical term is an exogenous shock. Often this is a speculative bubble. So we can see in the .com, the Great Recession, the Great Depression, all of these were caused by speculation of some sort. In .com, it was kind of in the e-commerce industry. Great Recession, it was both in the financial and the housing segments of the economy. And the Great Depression was a stock market bubble that sort of then kind of translated out into pretty much all parts of the economy. What I'm calling the virus recession comparisons, this is sort of an odd one. We didn't have a speculative bubble. We had a virus threat, which is very different. So the difference is also going to play out over time. So whereas in a typical recession, certain parts of the economy will continue on pretty much unchanged. In the .com and Great Recession, say your retail sector and your restaurant sector were not really that impacted. The areas that were impacted were those larger purchases such as autos or construction. During the virus, it's kind of been, well, it's not been the opposite, but up front, the retail and restaurants were hit hard at the front end of the recession. We'll have to see how it plays out in terms of consumer demand for some of those larger ticket items. Another thing to pay attention to is the economy is changing over time. So when Bradley Burns for sales tax first came into place in the early 1950s, we were a goods-based economy still back then. We've become much more of a services-based economy. And within about the last 20 years or so, 25 years, we've become more of a digital-based economy. The thing to highlight here is goods, in terms of sales tax, are taxable. Services and digital are sales tax base is fairly narrow. Neither one of those are taxable. So kind of what, as Fran was saying, kind of what are we going to look like going forward? What is going to be kind of our business model for both the state and our local governments? Some of the recovery rate considerations that I wanted to highlight are, as I mentioned before, consumer confidence is kind of key. Anticipation is sort of like the stock market. We're going to see some volatility. So until things calm down, consumer confidence is going to remain shaky, and that's going to affect people's willingness to invest in a home remodel or going out and buying a new car. Also, behaviors are going to be important. So if somebody may want to buy a new car, but they're not comfortable going to the dealership, well, that's going to affect that as well. So some things may change. Lastly, in terms of models, you've probably heard about some of these. There's the V-shaped recovery. There's a U-shaped. U-shaped is some people call a unicorn. It's never really happened before. That's kind of quick downturn, period down, then quick upturn. I don't think there's too many people on the U-shaped recovery. W would be a partial recovery. Maybe the virus comes back in the fall, then another downturn, and then recovery back again. The L model, this could be the L is sort of shaped the first part of the left part of the V, then it's just kind of depending upon the slope of the right portion of the V is if you kind of visualize it that way, is to how quickly we will recover. So economic conditions, I'm going to breeze through this pretty quickly. Most of you guys, I think, are pretty aware of most of this. Pre-COVID, we were at all-time highs for the stock market, for lows for unemployment, highs for extended period of growth. Unemployment, obviously has changed quite a bit. We went from about 3.5 to 20 plus. I think the state's looking at we might go up to 25% unemployment. Unheard of since the Great Depression. That's going to be very important, and it's going to be some of what we're basing some of our forecast on. GDP, this is an area that we were not exactly, gangbusters, but we were up close to 3% last year, kind of in the 2.5 to 3 this year before COVID. For April alone, the estimate is negative 33%. Again, unheard of for a single month to decline our GDP to decline by 1/3. Interest rates were pretty low before. Now they're getting close to zero. So the federal funds rate is now about 0.25, between 0 and 0.25. Inflation hadn't been a concern necessarily before. There was start to be talk of it. It's not a concern now. It may become a concern as a headwind for the recovery. Obviously, the stock market has kind of had its ups and downs. So that volatility we anticipate will continue. We saw a big stock market recovery based upon 8 people having a successful vaccine trial. So, I think there will be some whiplash stuff with the stock market. One of the things I wanted to talk about real briefly is just, sort of a comparison to what are the headwinds. There's a lot of bad news out there. As a comparable, in 1979, if you guys weren't muted, I would ask you what was the interest rate in 1979. The answer is 10%. What was the interest rate in 81? 20%. So you can imagine trying to buy a house or a car with an interest rate of 20%. As you know, obviously comparison to today, it's almost at zero. So, you know, we obviously had high headwinds. They were trying to tackle inflation, the Federal Reserve was at the time, but the economy did come back. You know, as we all know from the mid to late 80s, the economy was doing very well. So inflation came down, the interest rate came down, and we all kind of know the rest of that story. Obviously, we are in a global situation. So if we're looking at the pandemic kind of globally, China has a little bit different economy. They're a little bit more of a production-based economy, but we can get some clues as to how the recovery is going there. Likewise, in Europe, Germany in particular is kind of being seen as a model for how they handle the virus and how kind of they might come out in terms of recovery. We're just kind of getting to the recovery stage at this point. A few things looking forward in terms of supply chains. We've been talking about offshoring for quite a while. There's some thought that we might have some onshoring for supply chain reasons. Also, there has been some thought that that the tensions with China might kind of continue. They're competitively, it's kind of the U.S. and China sort of dueling it out to be kind of the world's top dog at this point. So we may be entering a little bit more of a kind of a new Cold War-ish sort of thing with China, which will be interesting to pay attention to. Obviously, innovation had been coming and disruption had been big words with the tech industry, affecting many aspects of our economy, healthcare, retail, obviously, to a certain extent, restaurants. We will continue to see this change. So the question is, what sort of impacts on revenues will the changes that are being sort of accelerated? These changes were already happening, but we're really seeing a big acceleration from the current COVID situation. So something like, say, some retailers, JCPenney, for instance, had kind of been on kind of a slow downward, slow death, if you will, for 10 or 20 years. You know, now the COVID situation sort of, you know, accelerating that transition for them. So some of the modeling assumptions for the pandemic that I wanted to talk to you guys about real quick. Much more greater modeling variability, as Fran had mentioned in her presentation. I was looking at BART's budget, the Bay Area Rapid Transit, the other day. They were looking at ridership numbers between 15% and 50%. So a 35% swing for their ridership for the upcoming fiscal year. That is just, you know, absolutely unheard of for an agency to have that sort of variability in their revenues. In terms of some of our assumptions, we think for a vaccine treatment and testing, for the vaccine, we're you know, obviously conservative estimate would be looking at widely available, maybe 2022 some point. More optimistic, we might see something next year, 2021. You know, maybe limited basis end of the year. We're starting to see some positive signs with some of the vaccines, so we hope that continues. Testing and treatments, testing, a lot of progress on that. We'll continue to see more testing coming in, treatments. There's been some positive developments there as well. So again, the optimistic timeline, a 3-year kind of V-shaped recovery. I think this is what, say, Chris Thornburg has mentioned at Beacon Economics. The president, I think, is on this sort of, he might be on the U, quite frankly, I think more conservatively, and I think where we're actually landing is sort of more of a 5+ year L. We think there's going to be a slower recovery just based upon unemployment, based upon what we would typically see, you know, in the depth of the amount of disruption in employment and that sort of thing. So quickly, I'll go through our sales tax numbers. We're looking at for Q2 down about 25%. That's Q2 will go through the end of June. Q3, July 1 through the end of September, we're looking at about 16%. Again, some of these are based upon when businesses are opening, kind of what's happening with employment, some of those things. Most of the downturn kind of happening through the end of the year. We think it will kind of Q1 might still continue to be slower, kind of recessionary, then starting to come out in Q2, and really the main recovery starting in a little over a year, kind of July of 2021 is our prediction. As Fran had mentioned, obviously these are our predictions at this point. We're looking at kind of a periodic forecast check to see where the numbers are. We like to road test our forecast to go through, just kind of see how those kind of baseline assumptions are playing out. We kind of take our different segments, retail, food, transportation, construction, B2B, and for the sheltering period, we've taken kind of a 2.5 to 3.5 month primary sheltering period, kind of through June 1 or through July 1, and done some different assumptions for different business segments. Again, some of this we're talking to our clients and kind of adjusting these numbers based upon local situations. Again, another thing on the sales tax forecast, looking at your top 25. If that's 60% of your sales tax, as friend David had mentioned, it's good to check in with those 25. Your economic development people are probably gonna have connections with most of them, and see what their thoughts are, how things have been going, how things are looking next year, and also sort of what the city can or county can do to help them through the process. So local revenue, property tax, we're looking at a minor decline for now. That will come next fiscal year. There's a little bit more of a lag on property tax. That will depend a bit on what your recent valuations are, how recent your valuations are. We do see an increase in commercial appeals. Sales tax, we're looking at about, over this year and next year, kind of 15 to 25% down. That's sort of assuming that there is progress on the vaccine development, that not too much of this economic downturn goes into kind of the white collar economy, that sort of thing. Hotel tax, we're looking at fairly extreme, but fairly short term. This we're kind of, looking at kind of a 4 to 6 month impact on extreme, then kind of starting to transition out of that. Medium term may vary a bit depending upon whether your jurisdiction has more kind of regional visitors or regional or state visitors versus international tourists. Obviously, the international tourists, we think that may take a little bit longer to come back as policies change. Business tax, everybody's business tax is a little bit different. So we think there will be a moderate impact here, but it varies a bit depending on your ordinance. Some ordinances, closures will be more important. Some, employee reductions or reduced gross receipts, et cetera. So, good to dig on those numbers a little bit. Property tax transfer, this only applies to some charter cities. Not too many have it, but that's going to be a large impact for jurisdictions such as Oakland and San Francisco, but it's going to be more short term. This is also sometimes called, that has to do with real estate transactions. Lastly, utility user tax, we're looking at it fairly flat to slight decline, at least initially. We don't think that will be impacted that much. I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to surf through here pretty quickly. Talk through federal stimulus. There's been a lot of work done here. The question is kind of to what extent this is going to bridge the gap. Federal Reserve has been very active. I think they've done, most people have said a good job following kind of the Great Recession playbook. They still say they have some dry powder, as they say, for their actions, but remains to be seen kind of how dramatic the Federal Reserve programs get. State and local stimulus, I think you guys heard last week about the latest in the stimulus package. I think about a third of it, 900 million, was going to go to state and local governments. Faces some stiff opposition when it goes over to the Senate. So I think this is going to be kind of the next big stimulus fight over the next few weeks, maybe a month. The election politics, kind of how's that going to play out on some of these stimuluses is kind of remains to be seen. We saw some of that kind of rearing its ugly head last week. Lastly, on the state level, I think most of you are aware of the extension and deferral programs. We should be getting a little bit more information from the CDTFA in the coming week or two on what we're seeing non-filers for Q1, how many people we might anticipate entering the deferral program at the end of July, and kind of what impacts that might mean. We've given our clients estimates on what that might look like, but stay tuned on that. Obviously, May revised came out yesterday. State being pretty conservative on their numbers. For sales tax, they were down about 27% year to year, which is kind of what we're doing, kind of to compare it to our numbers, was about 25%. Lastly, split roll initiative in the fall has potential to create some new revenues for property tax for different jurisdictions. I think it's a little iffy at this point as to whether that will pass. So thank you very much for having me. This is a little bit about our company, and if you have any further questions for me, happy to answer them after the end.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm going to go ahead and Dave, I'm going to make you the presenter, and I'll do a quick introduction of you while we're switching over. But we will be sharing all the slides from today's webinar, as well as a recording of the webinar afterwards. And as Tom mentioned, if you guys want to submit questions in the chat, we'll get to those after Dave's presentation, which will be kind of our third and final one. So Dave, are you with us?
I am.
Well, Dave, you could probably do a better introduction of yourself than I could, but suffice to say, Dave is a president and partner at FM3, Fairbank, Maslin & Mullen. As it's been long known, very highly regarded opinion polling, public opinion survey firm here in California. Dave, I mean, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of local agencies you've worked with on opinion surveys and revenue enhancements. But, you know, we've kind of been through what the lay of the land is for this year's budget. Dave is with us today to talk a little bit about how COVID is impacting the electorate and what that may mean for any revenue, potential revenue enhancements in the fall or thereafter. So Dave, go ahead, take it away.
All right, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Rob. So we're going to talk now about the other half of the equation when it comes to generating new sources of local revenue this year, which is outside of the financial context, where is public opinion? How willing are voters to embrace generating new revenue? And what do we know about where the public psyche is, given all of the shocks of the last couple of months from a public health, economic, and political perspective? I'm going to walk through some recent findings from our opinion research, mostly statewide, but with some references to the local level. Talk a little bit about where Californians are today in terms of their attitudes toward the virus and its impacts. Take a look back at the March election, which happened right before the virus really hit California, and I think also has some important lessons for us to consider as we look toward November. And then share some thoughts about what we've been seeing in our polling that provides some guidance about how local agencies may be successful in framing revenue measures in the November election. Now, all the data that I'm sharing here comes from doing opinion research with the public. And I think one of the questions we're getting most often these days is, can you even do opinion research? Is this a time when you can talk to voters and get any kind of a reliable indication of what they think? The short answer is yes. From a logistical perspective, pollsters have been working to come up with ways to make sure that we can carry out our work safely. In most cases, this means equipping interviewers to work from home using a laptop and make phone calls rather than working from call centers where they're sitting in proximity to one another or sharing equipment. And even when it comes to in-person qualitative research like focus groups, we've been turning to online methodologies that allow us to have open-ended conversations with smaller groups of voters to really dig into their mindsets and understand the reasons why they think what they think, that don't involve getting people into small groups, into close quarters in a room in the fashion of a traditional focus group. And in many respects, this has actually been a really good time to do opinion research. Our industry has been struggling over the last couple of years with declining response rates, fewer people who are willing to pick up the phone and talk to a pollster. But we have actually seen those response rates go up over the course of the last couple of weeks. People have a lot more free time. They need a break from their family or their work at home, and so they're willing to talk to us. And we've seen some reports of response rates as much as 25% higher than normal, which means that we can actually be more confident that we're getting a representative sample because a wider variety of voters are willing to engage in that conversation with us. And this has been particularly true in our research for local government clients, whether it's cities or counties or school districts. The questions that public agencies need to put to voters right now are ones that are highly relevant to their lives. What are the things you see as the biggest problems facing your community? Where does the virus and its impacts fit in? How do you feel about what you pay in taxes? And would you be willing to support a revenue increase if it were on the November ballot? These are pretty consequential questions that can have real life impacts on voters as public agencies are faced with tough decisions about what to do with declining revenues and increasing demand for services. And so we're finding that more often they're willing to take the time to talk to us, and in some cases it's even hard to end the conversations because they like having a chance to share their opinion. And most importantly, and this is a concern that we've been hearing from some clients, particularly public agencies that are mindful of not wanting to give offense to their constituents, we have really seen essentially no evidence of people who are taking any offense or feel imposed upon by outreach to do a public opinion survey. In fact, as I've said, it's really been quite the opposite. So given that we can do this kind of research, what are some of the things that we are learning? First, just a few notes on the overall mood of the electorate these days. One of the first questions most pollsters begin their polls with is, do you think things in your state or your local community are headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? This is just a baseline way of measuring people's gut sentiments about the direction of their community. And in California, as you'll see here, positive sentiments have been declining over the last couple of years, driven largely by concerns around homelessness, cost of housing, cost of living more broadly, traffic congestion, issues that Californians saw as kind of intractable. But over the course of the last couple of weeks, those numbers have really turned around. You'll see in a poll that we did in late April, 52% of Californians said things were heading in the right direction, just 38% on the wrong track. And there's a feeling of solidarity. I think that people within communities are facing a common challenge here and feel a little bit more positive about that sense of community than we'd seen in recent polling. And that's always more prevalent at the local levels. You'll see at the bottom of the slide, an even more solid majority feel positively about how things are going in their city. This has also meant that we have seen more positive feelings about public officials. As you'll see, the governor's favorability ratings took a dramatic increase over the last 6 months. In April polling, we had 64% of voters viewing him favorably. That's up 17 points from where it was last year. And governors across the country have seen similar increases. The legislature went from being viewed in a net negative perspective to a net positive one. And then in that third cluster of bars on this slide, your city's mayor, your local K-12 school district, basically more than 2-to-1 favorable ratings. Those traditionally have always been more positive, but essentially the good feelings Californians have extend to public agencies. And to a large degree, this is because voters believe they have been doing a good job of handling the pandemic. You'll see data from a recent statewide survey here where we asked people whether they approved or disapproved of the job that various levels of government were doing in handling the pandemic. Local government led the way with 78% of Californians approving of their performance, state government not far behind at 72%. Obviously more negative evaluations of the federal government, and that largely has to do with the overall political cast of opinion in California. But this means that the public is feeling pretty good, both a little bit higher sense of sort of community sentiment and also very positive feelings about state and local government. So what are the issues that are most on their minds? In a survey we did a couple of weeks ago, we asked our respondents to rate the seriousness of a variety of problems facing California and to rank them on a 4-point scale as either extremely, very, somewhat, or not too serious. They're ranked here by the total proportion that rate each issue either an extremely or very serious problem, running down the right-hand side. And not surprisingly, you'll see coronavirus at the top of the list. Its economic impacts are a concern to 67% of voters, its public health impacts to 53%. And by the way, those are the proportions rating them an extremely serious problem. So with a lot of intensity, more than 3/4 view them as at least very serious. But clustered around them, you'll see a range of other issues: cost of healthcare, cost of housing, risk of wildfires. If we had asked homelessness in this survey, it would have been near the top of the list as well. And concern about those issues has not diminished. More than 7 in 10 continue to rate them very serious problems. And those sentiments are very similar to where voters were before the pandemic. As you'll see on a range of these issues that we've tracked at the state level over the course of the last couple of years, the changes have really been pretty minimal within the margin of error, with the exception of unemployment. That's the one that's really vaulted up now, with 73% rating it an extremely or very serious problem, up 24 points from where it was a couple of years ago. So the dynamic we're seeing, and this bears out in local polling as well, is not that coronavirus is replacing other concerns, but that it is joining them. Now, at the same time, looking forward, voters believe that we are not out of the woods. Half of Californians think the worst of the pandemic is yet to come. Only about 1/4 think the worst is over. You'll see on the right-hand side of this slide some of the demographic groups that disproportionately take one view or the other, and it's largely ideologically driven at this point, with more left-leaning voters tending to think the worst is yet to come, more right-leaning voters thinking that the worst is over. But in California, obviously, there's more voters in the center and on the left, and so they tend to be looking toward the future with a little bit of apprehension. And that apprehension does extend to the way that they feel about their household finances. And certainly when we think about local tax and revenue increases in November, voters' degree of financial comfort is going to play a major role. About 1/3 of the electorate right now says they are uneasy about being able to meet their living expenses. Only 65% are confident, only 38% very confident. That sentiment tends to cut across geographies, across ethnic groups, and even across partisan lines. The differences here aren't that great. But this is a key variable we're going to be tracking as we move toward November. Obviously, if the economic forecasts are correct and we're headed in for a couple of months here of continued unemployment and a slow recovery, we may see these feelings of unease start to work their way up more toward a larger segment of more middle-class voters. The health risks are also a concern, but somewhat less of one. Only about 44% say that they're extremely very concerned someone in their family will get sick from coronavirus. That concern tends to be concentrated among lower income households, residents of larger cities, LA County in particular, not surprisingly, since that's the part of the state that's been hardest hit, and also within the African American community. Here we had a question where we asked people to sort of weigh these two potential concerns against one another: concern of infection versus concern of economic impact, and they're about evenly split statewide. More concern among Democrats about the health risks, more from Republicans on the economy, and that's certainly what we've seen in a range of other polling around the country as well. And then finally, when we ask people to look forward and think about how quickly they think the virus will be under control, when we frame it as a 6-month or 12-month time period and test it both ways, we see that 3 and 5 are relatively confident that the pandemic will be under control in that period, which extends roughly to the election in November. But when we ask about the economic impacts, there's much more ambivalence. A majority think the economy in California will not recover in the next 6 months, which takes us to November. And even when we ask about a 1-year time horizon, it's only the plurality that expects an economic recovery over that period of time. So overall, what this is telling us is the coronavirus is a dominant concern. The economic impacts, somewhat more than the health impacts, are sort of on voters' minds as longer-term problems. And as we look toward November, there's a significant set of voters that are feeling some economic unease. So the context of the pandemic is certainly one thing that we need to think about when we think toward November revenue measures, but we also need to look at what happened in March. And I think our consideration of the impacts of the March election was kind of cut off by the emergence of the virus. but it really was dramatic. And I think we need to understand some of the dynamics that led into what happened. There were far more revenue measures at the local level on the ballot in California in March than had been the case in any recent primary election, over 230 total. And only 40% of those measures won approval. Compare that as you look here at past primary elections and the analysis Michael Coleman does after each election. Majorities of the measure passed in every primary election dating back to 2006. And since 2012, they've been approved at more than a 2/3 clip pretty regularly. The negative reactions basically cut across all types of measures. Each row of the table you'll see on this slide shows different kinds of measures at the city level, the county level, the special district, whether they're measures that require simple majority approval, 55% for school bonds, or 2/3 supermajority approval. On the far right-hand column, you'll see the approval rates are really, other than city general taxes, about 2/3 of which were passed, the approval rates are 50% or below. And even for city general taxes, it was only 2/3 that were approved, well below the record of the prior few primary elections where virtually all of them won approval. So clearly there were strongly negative outcomes in March, almost unprecedented, and certainly unprecedented in recent memory. And the negative sentiments were evident when we did some post-election polling and we asked people in communities that had local school bond measures on the ballot, where relatively small numbers were approved, whether they voted yes or voted no. The key distinction that we'll see here in the demographics is along partisan lines. Most Democrats said they voted in favor, most Republicans voted against, but independent voters, a plurality of them indicated that they voted no on their local school, 41%. That's an unusual response in California. Independents tend to look a little bit more like Democrats in terms of how they vote on finance measures. And so clearly something shifted in that election. Based on our post-election analysis and some research that we did after the election, there's 5 factors that we would point to that we think are critical. And as you consider these factors, think towards November and how many of these are likely to still be in place in November and how many of them might be somewhat unique to the circumstances in March. First, we saw an increasingly negative voter mood. More voters thought that things were headed on the wrong track. Concern about issues like homelessness, the cost of living, affordable housing, gain new levels of intensity. And those concerns, I think, led voters to be a little more fiscally conservative than they had typically been. Secondly, the reason there were so many measures on the ballot in March was hopes that there would be a big surge in voter turnout driven by the presidential primary. More Democrats, younger voters, voters of color tending to show up. All voters that typically are more supportive of local finance measures. That did not materialize. Turnout was only a couple of points higher than it was in the 2016 primary. And there's a number of factors that contributed, certainly the emergence of the virus, but also the fact that the presidential primary lost most of its steam, with a number of candidates dropping out. Before Super Tuesday, a lot of Democrats held their ballots until the last minute. And among Democrats who didn't vote, a lot of them said the reason they didn't vote was their favorite candidate was no longer in the race. The stock market turbulence related to COVID obviously was another factor. The first big drop in the stock market came the week before the election. And that certainly could have had some impact on voters' economic expectations. Concerns about the virus were starting to take hold. And then obviously when it comes to bond measures, the impacts of AB 195 requires more of the ballot language spent talking about fiscal impacts. We've seen has had a consistently negative impact on the performance of local finance measures. And that, I think, blended with a lot of these other concerns to help contribute to the surprisingly negative results that we saw in March. So how many of these factors are likely to still be in place in November? Obviously, we can't say for sure. AB 195 almost certainly will, but a couple of these items will not. The lack of a progressive turnout surge is far less likely to be a concern in November than in March. General election turnout in presidential years, even bad ones, is overwhelmingly higher and brings out more of these younger and more left-leaning voters. And I think we can feel pretty confident that that is likely to happen this November, given the intense feelings that voters have around the presidential race. But the other three items on this slide, the impact of COVID, the impact of the stock market and the economy more broadly, and voters' overall mood, which was negative in early March, but as we saw earlier, has rebounded since, are much harder to project in terms of where they're going to be. So what is it that we can conclude from the data that we have at hand right now about the environment for passing revenue measures in November, and what is it we can tell voters that may sort of reflect some of these things that are on their minds and can potentially put revenue measures in the best possible light? The findings I'm going to share with you over the next couple slides come from a range of polling we've done in the last couple of weeks, including some of the statewide surveys I've shared already, but more particularly, a range of local surveys. We've done several dozen surveys for local governments at all levels, cities, counties, school districts, special districts, that have been looking at the potential for revenue measures in all regions of the state, communities of all different sizes. And there are some pretty consistent trends that we've been seeing in that data. Now, obviously, we still need to be mindful that there's a long time between now and November, and every community is going to vary. But there are some things that have been pretty consistent. The first is the extraordinarily high degree of interest in the November election. When asked to statewide to rate their interest in the election on a 10-point scale, 83% rate themselves extremely interested. The average score on this 10-point scale is a 9.5. This is about the highest we have seen in any of our polling over the course of the last decade or so in terms of interest in an upcoming election. And so this is an encouraging sign to suggest the turnout may well be high, which again, all else equal, tends to create a good environment for local finance measures. So what are we seeing in terms of public level of support in polling? The first thing to note is that in cases where we have done a poll post-pandemic and have a poll prior to the pandemic that we can compare back to, that's a reasonable benchmark, we have seen very consistent levels of support for local finance measures. Most of them are within a few percentage points of where they were before the pandemic, suggesting that since the concerns they address are ones that were present before and remain there, voters' economic anxiety so far is not providing a major deterrent to supporting them. This is particularly true when we're talking about renewals of existing taxes. Obviously, those kinds of measures are always easier to pass. Voters are far more likely to vote for a tax that's already in place and is already working. You can avoid cuts in services without having to pay more. And that dynamic continues to be true in our current environment. To the extent that we have seen more fluidity in support, it tends to come in communities with larger numbers of lower income voters, who based on our polling are the ones who are reporting the greatest degree of increased economic anxiety in the wake of the pandemic. More affluent communities, we're seeing much less of this kind of variation. In terms of funding mechanisms, perhaps not surprisingly, those funding mechanisms that are less broad-based, that are targeting users of specific products, like marijuana taxes, for example, or that have some kind of a progressive element built in, real estate transfer taxes on homes with higher sale prices, or at the state level, looking at the idea of an income tax on more affluent households. Those tend to have both the broadest and most consistent support, with more variability in broader based taxes like sales taxes. Although, as I say, in most cases, they're holding steady more than they're dropping. But I do need to note, as we look at these early trends, that as encouraging as they are right now, any poll is obviously just a snapshot of a moment in time, and all of the dynamics around public health and the economy and politics are going to shift between now and November, and we need to be mindful that we need to continue to monitor them. And in terms of public agencies doing public opinion research, you face an August deadline to place a measure on the ballot. Obviously, the longer you can wait to get a final reading of public opinion into July, the more likely it is you'll be able to capture some of the shifts that may happen between now and then. So finally, what are we seeing in polling are effective ways of framing local revenue measures as we look toward November? First, we're seeing that there is, in some cases, heightened urgency around addressing pre-existing concerns. If voters are concerned about affordable housing before, at a time when many voters are unable to pay their rent and are facing potential evictions, depending on what local laws are showing, the voters may be even more supportive of investment in affordable housing. Parks and recreation in some cases, as more people are spending time in parks and out of doors because that's one of the few entertainment options available to them, we're in some cases seeing heightened support for investments in those kinds of services. So it may well be that there's just a new argument or an increased urgency to making a case for some of the same investments that were previously popular. The idea that now that local governments are facing the need to cut services, that additional revenue can be a way of preventing or restoring those cuts as opposed to providing new or enhanced services. Typically measures that are talking about preventing a backwards move as opposed to taking a step forward get broader support from the public. And so clarifying that context may be helpful. Third, job creation. We typically see that the creation of jobs or the boosting of the local economy is at best a secondary message as a reason for voting for a local finance measure. But it may well be that the stimulus that comes from local construction projects, especially if we can say that a local bond measure is going to have incentives or requirements to hire local workers, can be very compelling and maybe more compelling now than it was before, as well as just the notion that investing more dollars at the local level has spillover effects, which can boost the overall economy. Fourth, when we're talking about capital measures, the notion that as we spend on improving, upgrading, or building public facilities, that we can do so with an eye toward making sure they are resilient toward future public health problems of the kind we're experiencing now. For example, with libraries, ensuring that they are built with spaces or provisions for cleaning or sanitation that can address the fact that multiple users need to use them simultaneously and potentially in close quarters. There may be some arguments about the need to change public infrastructure to reflect our new realities that may be compelling parts of a capital finance measure. Fifth, strong public support for the work of essential workers, which include many public employees who have had to stay on the job in the current emergency. The public appreciates their work and wants to invest in programs that can support them and help to keep them safe. And that, again, may be part of a local finance measure. Sixth, the notion that we need to prepare for emergencies, that we can provide dollars to local government to ensure that they are ready for emergencies to come. Pandemics weren't necessarily the kinds of emergencies we spent a lot of time thinking about previously, but seismic risks are always there. And the notion that we have to have 911 emergency communications, seismically safe facilities, while always important to voters, this may be another reminder that these kinds of emergencies can come out of nowhere, and we are better off spending dollars to prepare for them than to deal with their aftermath. And then finally, concerns around equity. We have seen in much of our polling in California a broad recognition among Californians that the burden of the pandemic has not been equally shared. It has fallen disproportionately on low-income communities and communities of color in California. And so measures, particularly in communities that are diverse and have residents who have been feeling a disproportionate weight of the pandemic, framing measures as ways of addressing some of these inequities and ensuring that communities receive the support that they need and deserve can also be an effective framing as well. So these are some of the patterns that we've been seeing so far. Again, I think some of these findings are likely to evolve as time passes, but hopefully it gives you some sense of what may be effective ways to talk about local government revenue measures moving forward. So with that, I know we are tight on time. I want to make sure we can turn it over for questions. Rob, I will hand it back to you.
Dave, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for hanging in with us. We will open it up to questions now. Before we do so, I want to make one more thank you to our presenters first, but also thanks to our sponsor, Hawthorne Gardening, second webinar they've sponsored for us here in the past month or so. So thanks to them. In terms of questions, I've got a question off the top. Any insights on extending UUTs? And you know, I could pose that to both Dave and Tom, and what your thoughts are there.
Dave, do you want to go first on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think from a perspective of public support, if we're talking about an extension of a UUT, I think we're in pretty good shape. If you can essentially go to voters and say this is no increase in rates, and we'll continue to fund services that might otherwise need to be cut. Obviously, to the extent that voters are spending more time at home and their utility usage is going up relative to where it was before, even if those rates are held constant, that may result in higher bills, depending on which utilities we're talking about. And that's something we haven't explored in research so far, but those dynamics are ones that obviously will need a close look. A lot may depend on voters' expectation of how much longer they're going to be at home versus when they'll be able to return to work.
We haven't done any special analysis on this, but there are a lot of potential changes in the UUT world that, again, it could, some of that could come up during the election. Some of the over-the-top video considerations and some of that's not out there currently, but that could be used as an argument against it. So I would agree that I wouldn't have too much an extension, but there may be messaging that, again, that might not ordinarily be there just because some of those issues are already out and being discussed about expanding UUT to some of the video services.
Okay. Another question. What kinds of measures are cities looking at more aggressively, particularly things that they may have given a pass to in the past? So cannabis as an example, or gaming or other untapped revenues that could plug holes in vital services. And I know cannabis is one that I think is particularly interesting. Dave, what are you guys seeing on that?
Yeah, I think, our experience is that cities are taking a harder look at some of those taxes. Both because there's a broad base of public support, and I think, after a couple of years of having legal recreational sales, some of the cultural stigma around it has really declined, and communities that may have been hesitant to authorize sales are now more open to it. Obviously, things like gaming that rely on people gathering in places to participate in these activities together, that's a little bit more dicey. But generally speaking, the trends that we're seeing here, particularly given some of those equity concerns I highlighted, where income inequality in California has been pretty big and getting bigger, and I think the pandemic has only reinforced that. The more progressive a tax structure is, the more appealing it tends to be to the public, and so we're seeing communities taking that into account as well.
And Tom and Fran, I know you guys do work, at least on the cannabis front, out about gaming. Do you guys have thoughts on your client cities and how that's evolving?
I mean, it'll be interesting if how the gaming's expanded. We're not quite sure how that's going to look, but anytime you're taxing somebody other than yourself, it's always a good thing. So if you're taxing, hotel tax has been popular, cannabis tax has been popular. I think the one other that obviously has been popular is sales tax, so that applies to more people. But I mean, at a certain point, we've seen some communities with, I think, close to 17, 18% on the hotel tax. At a certain point, it does make your local community less attractive. Most people don't really think about that when they're, making their decisions, whether it's cannabis or hotel, as far as we can tell.
So in other words, if the rates are too high, the businesses don't prevail. Okay, another question, and Tom, this one may be more for you. Sales tax and TOT projections given were more general. Can you offer any information for small coastal cities with no corporate retail sales tax or TOT generators or big corporate drivers? So again, I think that calls for some generalizations probably too, but smaller cities that maybe don't have some of those big drivers. What are you guys kind of thinking in counseling those kinds of communities?
Well, again, it's really looking through your sales tax base, how much percent of your top 25 is generating the total of your sales tax. So for many smaller cities, there can be a couple large producers that may be producing, 75, maybe even up to 85% of their sales tax from their top 25. So if that's the case, you go through your top 25 and try to figure out who those owners are, and what the anticipation are. Are they going to stay in business? Are they what exactly is going to happen with them? On the restaurant front, a lot of small cities have more restaurants. If you have more fast food restaurants, those businesses have been, and we anticipate they will continue to do better business because of drive-throughs, the sort of social distancing already sort of there in place. They're used to doing it. But really, it's kind of going through, without knowing the specifics, it's really going through your top 25, your top 100, kind of grinding a bit on how those specific business segments are going to look going forward. A lot of communities, hear from their main street sort of districts that they're going to have business closures, but just because you have 10%, 25% of your restaurants closed, those restaurants may, if it's 25%, may only be generating 5 to 10% of your sales tax. So those are the sort of things that you want to kind of go through. So kind of taking those kind of top line figures of hearing all these horror stories, some of those Main Street businesses may not be actually generating much sales tax for the city. They're important, they're locally owned, it's tragic, everything else, but in terms of revenues, it may not be as bad as kind of all the talk around it.
There was a question about what is the potential for property tax reductions through reassessment by the counties, and when would that occur, or when would that hit the local budgets?
Yeah, I think that we'll start seeing those. I'm trying to think. You would probably seeing it sort of middle of what would it be? It would need to go through the process and everything else. I'm trying to think. It would probably be about a year from now when you would start seeing that. You probably want to check in with your county assessor just to double check on kind of how they're processing them.
Yeah, Tom, I think this is Fran. I think that you're going to find that that's lagging about 2 years before
2 years. Okay.
Yeah. And I think in a current environment, we're probably not going to see a whole lot of change on the residential side, but I think it's going to be very interesting to watch the commercial side, given the economic impact of business closures and stay at home and telecommuting and how that's all working out. It's already showing up in San Francisco as a very high potential and indicated vacancy rate in commercial office buildings. And that's going to put pressure on assessors to do something about reassessing those. But I don't believe you'll see the impact of that on your revenue until probably 2 years out.
Yeah, some of that's
thank you.
a little political depending upon who your assessor is. So,
Interesting. Okay. Well, I think that we're a little bit over time, and I think that's just about the end of all the questions we have. I guess I'd ask each of our panelists if they have any closing thoughts for the group. Not to put you on the spot.
I just reiterate from my end, I don't envy any of you having to do, revenue preparation, budget preparation in this environment. Things are not going to settle down for at least another 12 to 18 months before you get any kind of clarity on where you're going. So I encourage you to be open to revision, communication, gaining input, going to be critical. And, if any of you are going out for revenue measures, that's a tenuous at best effort, I think, in this environment, but probably a necessary one for a lot of you. And I wish you a lot of luck.
Yeah, I think from that perspective, the way we've tried to forecast it is trying to be conservative, but not too conservative, if that makes sense. So trying to, anticipate that what your worst case scenario is and kind of back off from that and into something that you're at least in the ballpark of if it gets worse. So we in our own forecasting, we're trying to be fairly conservative, but not kind of worst case scenario. So that's why I say, you can look at this kind of V-shaped recovery. Hopefully, hopefully we're wrong and it is a V, but I think most people are looking at a little bit longer recovery on that kind of L-shaped recovery, that sort of 5+ year time frame of kind of coming back to where we might have been. But again, where we're going to be in 5 years might be very different from where we are now. And again, our sales tax is pretty narrow here, so it'll be interesting to see kind of how things change in the recovery.
Yeah, and this is Dave. I guess I would just add, if I had one suggestion, it would just be to remain as nimble and flexible as you can. Obviously, there are legal and budgetary constraints that you all are facing as you plan ahead here, but we're just in a very tumultuous time. And I would encourage you not to be cautious, but don't think of any doors as closed. The soundings that we're seeing right now seem to indicate that a lot of Californians are willing to open up their wallets and try to do what it is to help local government get through the challenging times that we're facing. That may not hold up, things may change, but so far that door isn't closed. And so doing everything you can to keep your options open, I think is a wise strategy right now.
Well, thanks, Dave. I'll put just like a period on our webinar here today. We will again share the PowerPoints. It will have the contact information for each of the presenters in the PowerPoints. I think they're fairly easy to find on the World Wide Web as well if you want to conduct more follow-up questions or you want to pursue any of the things that were discussed today. I want to thank our sponsor again, Hawthorne Gardening. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us. We will, in addition to sending the slides, send a short survey about this. It would really help us if you guys would complete that survey. It'll just be 3 or 4 questions to help us kind of improve if we were to do anything like this again. And I'll make one last final plug for California City News, California County News, and all of our publications. We do have the largest job boards for local government in the state. We filled more than 10,000 jobs since our founding. So when you're looking for your next opportunity or looking to fill a position in your agency, please take a look at those. And with that, we'll conclude. And thanks, everyone, and best of luck to all of you.